The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. This is Travis McGrath. I'm presenting this month's support lab, the first of two. I'm very excited today. Our 2019.1 release, which should be coming out imminently, it's not out yet, but it'll be out soon, is coming up. And we've been doing a couple of support labs already on new features. If you recall back last month, we did one on the config changes. This month, what we wanted to do was take the support lab and use it as a excuse, if you will, to showcase some small features in the new release. So some more minor enhancements, some subtle things that we want to highlight here. So this is really all about the small things. So just to make sure everyone can see my screen and hear me all right, in the right panel on your screen, in your GoToWebinar panel, you'll be on mute, but if you want to ask questions, if you want more details, or if you want me to back up and say something again for any reason, you can always post there. And I see a couple of people who are familiar with their support labs have already written in there and make sure you can hear me and see my screen okay. But if at any point you have any questions, post them right there. Great, so today's agenda, we're gonna dive into the minor enhancements. And just as an overview, we're gonna cover 4 things. So first, we're gonna cover some tech stuff. By that, I mean, installer and some more of the sort of technical and deployment details. We're gonna cover the API. There are a few subtle API changes, so we're just gonna talk over what those are. We'll look at the admin page. There's some new admin settings. Some of them can be impactful, and we wanna make sure you're aware of them there. And then we're gonna look at the front end. There are some minor UX changes, and we want to highlight those as they exist. Great. So diving right into it, let's get into the tech stuff. We're going to jump back and forth between showing things in a presentation here and in the product itself. But we're going to start off just by mentioning that we officially now are supplying zip files for the installation. This has been a request from some folks who are trying to script the installation or integrate the installation of Exago into your own platform's installation or installer. In order to do that, previously you had to run either the Linux scripts, something Tom showed us in our previous support lab last month, or you had to run the exe file in Windows. Now you can directly download the zip files. And we're doing this not only with 19.1, but if you've done this already, you'll know that it's available on our 18.2 release. I'll show you that page on our support site in just a moment. Speaking of the installer, so in addition to having the zip files directly, so if you want to do a silent install, you can do so, we have some updates to our installer. Most notably in our Windows environment, the installer now sets permissions for the config folder within the application. So it's one less step you have to do there if you're doing a new install on a new machine. Additionally, our Linux installer now runs a script to start the Linux services for the scheduler. So it's a little less programming you have to do there as well. Great. One other tech thing I want to highlight, this is a feature that's actually been rolled out in 18.2, but has an enhancement in 19.1, which is that throughout our application, where we can, we're pushing more formulas. So you'll think of the formulas that have been showcased in some of the end user support labs of the past. We're pushing those down to the database to let the formulas be calculated. Now, that can happen in many parts of our application. There are filtering by formulas, there's formulas on a report, and there's sorting by formulas. Previously, sort formulas were not passed down to SQL, but they are now, and I'll show you a cool thing that you can do with those. And then lastly, we've just added a little bit of extra information to our logs. So if you're looking through our log files, we're now adding the thread and report IDs. So if you have multiple users running reports at the same time, you want to know which executions are happening, you can now see right in the log file the thread and report IDs to make it easy to search and track if you're looking for specific content there. So with that, I'm just going to take these 4 items and we'll jump over to our knowledge. So first off, just want to show where to get those zip files. So if you're in our support center, you've logged in, you hit download, you choose the version you want, you get to this page, you'll notice after you agree to our EULA there, instead of just having the Windows and Linux installer, we now have a zip archive, and this will be available on 18.2 and 19.1, and then of course moving forward. So if you're doing a silent install, you now have access to the files you need, which makes a lot of sense. The installer updates, I'm not going to run through those specifically or showcase anything, just to say that when you install the Exago application, the config folder here will already have its permission set. And while we're in here, I'm actually going to drill down. So this is just a Windows installation on my local machine. And I'm going to drill down into my config, and then there's a subfolder called other. And there's one file here called dbconfigs. And what I want to highlight here, which is really neat, is it's a JSON file that gives you what's called a formula dictionary based on your data source. So if you're working Oracle, MySQL, DB2, whatever you have there. The formula dictionary is actually something that you can add to. So we'll probably do some examples of this in a future webinar, in a future support lab. But this is a really neat way. So these formulas are recognized by Exago, they're Exago formulas. If they're used on a report and they're found here, they can be pushed down to the database. So now any of these formulas, it can push that sort down to the database and let the processing happen there instead of having to pull more data and do another sort in memory. One of the neat things about this file, and particularly to highlight, is that if you have a custom function, so if you've built a custom function, we've done several of them in the past, and it's something that can be done in your database natively, if there's some analogous database function, you can actually add that here as well. So you can increment this list based on your provider, or your data source, I should say, to include your own custom functions, and those will be pushed down to the database where appropriate. So that's now being done on sorts. And then finally, just the logs. I don't have to show you guys the log files. We've covered that in a support lab on troubleshooting in the past. So as you guys know, I like to say a lot of things very quickly. So just running through those 4 items, I want to pause, see if there are any questions so far. And one question did come in. I mentioned a couple of past support labs. Of course, all of our support labs, including this one, are recorded and available on our knowledge base. So that's right under, if you go to our knowledge base, right under videos, you'll see the end user and admin support labs. And we have about 2 or so videos now. We've been doing 2 a month for a couple of years. Pretty good. Okay, perfect. So we'll keep going and we'll move over to the API changes. Don't worry, this isn't a highly technical lab. We're not going to dive deep into code here. I just want to highlight a couple of changes. So one I want to highlight, it's not the most minor of things, so it's actually going to be the topic for the next support lab, which will be at the end of this month, is that the JavaScript API now has the ability to add filters to a report when doing direct executions. That's something that my colleague Nick is going to highlight in the lab at the end of the month, but I wanted to mention it is a cool new JavaScript API capability. The batch REST API, so we've done a webinar on batch REST before, and it always started by posting a new session. So batch REST was the idea that you could bundle a bunch of REST calls into a single web service call, and it always started with creating a new session. Now you can do a batch REST where you can reference an existing session. So maybe you could start a session, make some calls, and then batch a bunch of calls onto that session as well. One change, and we'll in our changelog, I'll show you this in just a second, is that data objects now have a requirement to have an ID. There's always been an ID property for many years on data objects, but it's now a required field. So that's a change that will impact the API, and specifically in the API, the data objects are called entities, and there's a new method. So what I'm going to do over here is I'm going to pull up our changelog. So just like in 18.2, if you're on our download page and you scroll down, you'll see our release notes. Of course, with our major release, you'll see those same notes. And of course, we start with enhancements and then move down to minor changes and bug fixes here. So we talked about the config changes and static configs in the last support lab I gave. We just mentioned formulas and sorts. I'll mention a couple of others in just a minute, but here, what I wanted to do is highlight the API changes there. So the setting the API is one, and there's a new method for generating the entities that will be here. Great. Okay, so cruising through the API changes. I see there are a couple of questions that are a little more specific. I'm going to leave those to some of my colleagues who are on the line, and they can answer those individually. So moving through the API, we can look at the admin. There's some new settings that I want to make sure you're aware of. They are minor, but they have some interesting impacts. The first one is there's an active role setting. So under the main settings, we'll see this in just a moment, is a new setting called active role. So previously, when we've talked about roles, these are sort of settings that are generally done via the API. There's a role.activate method, or there's a way to set the active role on the role object or in the admin console. Those still work just fine. You can still use those through the API. You don't need to make any changes there. But what they set the specific sessions property to specify that what the active role is. So instead of the role being activated at an object level, it's now a general setting, and then it will be set to active and reference it by name or ID, if you will. So this isn't a major change, it's just a small admin thing. I'll show it in just a moment. We have an option for adding bulk metadata, and you might ask, why would I do that? In a previous lab, we covered the options, and so with that enhancement to 19.1, there's now no performance concerns around having large config files. So one of the things we can do and encourage for performance is to add metadata on all your data objects that will reduce the number of queries to the database for schema. It'll make it more performant, and as a result, you want to add the metadata. But if you have, a couple hundred data objects, you don't want to add them one by one, have to click through. So we added a bulk metadata option, and I'll show you that as well. There's a couple of settings, Boolean flags for what we call folder management caching. So if you're using folder management, the extensibility feature, instead of querying the report list in many places, what we can do is we can actually hang on to that list and keep it in memory. And we found that this is another minor performance enhancement. It'll get upgraded if anything, updated if anything changes, but the ability to reduce the number of calls, subsequently sort of number of database queries, is a performance enhancement. So that's a flag I want to show you, and that'll be enabled by default, something you can have and consider there. And then finally, parameters, the placeholders we've used throughout a lot of extensibility options in many support labs of the past now support a Boolean type. So in addition to having text and dates and numerics, there's now a Boolean parameter flag as well. So we can jump over here. I'll sign into my local copy of my admin console. We've already looked at the config options. So what I'll do is I'll show that main settings. So under our main settings, you see we have an active role. We can or the name of whatever roles we might have. I just have one called video. I use, of course, here when presenting webinars. For adding bulk metadata, when we want to, we can add options here on our sources to quickly add metadata for all our data objects. And you'll actually notice our data objects are now grouped by data source. So we can see, if you have multiple data sources, in this case, I just have the one, you can see them now grouped not just alphabetically, but by data source, and you can collapse a single data source's objects. And then, of course, you can right-click on that data object, and you have an option to add metadata. And you'll notice the objects that don't have metadata, I have a little exclamation point next to. That's a warning saying, hey, this doesn't have metadata. Metadata is not enabled here. Okay. And then finally, and the easy way to find this one, of course, is just to use our search. We have a couple of new settings around report caching. So here, I just want to highlight these settings: the enable report list cache, enable report XML cache, and the report XML cache timeout. So these will do a couple of things. The report list cache will control how Exago queries for the left menu. This will actually rely on the user and company ID parameters similar to the scheduler. So those, of course, are always created as parameters here in the admin console. The report XML caching will store the definition of a report, particularly useful as you work with dashboards. So this is a great performance enhancement for dashboards. If you edit and then immediately execute a dashboard, we don't have to query that XML definition multiple times. It's just cache for a certain amount of time, and you can control how long that cache exists. And then lastly, if you're adding a new parameter here, in addition to the string, date, and integer, the numerics, as I mentioned, we now have Boolean parameters, so you can just set true or false values as you would expect with other types of parameters. And one last one I forgot to show, we can actually showcase this on the front end as well, is there's an option to have a show SQL in the advanced designer. So what we can do is so if we search for it, it's called show SQL window. So this is a new setting. If you set it to true, and then we jump over to the front end, if we edit a report and we go to the advanced options, we can now have a button here to show generated SQLs. Look at what SQLs created on the report and display it in a window. Previously, we had done this in our troubleshooting lab using a server event. We call that server event show SQL, but because it's a useful resource for debugging, we built it directly natively into the product, so you don't have to add extra code or do anything tricky. You can just have it here, and of course you can hide this so it's only available to admins or internal users as you see fit. Okay, great. So that's our admin console updates there. And then the last one here is on the front end. I talked a lot about the technical and the back end pieces. So there are a couple of front end enhancements. First, we have a dashboard reflow. So this is a feature previously was available using an action event, and now is something that's built into the default application. We have some UX changes throughout the application. Most notably, I'm going to showcase the new report menu. We have some minor enhancements to the font menu to make it easier to use there. And our maps, so Google Maps and Geo Maps, now have legend options, and action events can be enabled on those maps. So there's some extensibility examples. We'll likely do more in-depth labs on those in the future, so I'm not going to dive too deep on those, but I wanted to mention them just as so to highlight this, if we come to our, just our normal front page, a couple of notes. I have a custom getting started page. This will be likely a future lab, so this is more of a teaser there. But what I can do is I can open up our new report menu, and you'll notice sort of a cleaner set of icons. The cross-tab and chain reports, if they're enabled, are minimized so that a user isn't overwhelmed with options. They just have 3 options, express for easy, advanced reports, and then dashboards, but it'll remember if they've expanded this. So if I come back into it later using user preferences, this will keep a note and make sure this is open for me because I'm an advanced user. I might want to have these at my fingertips. But if I come into our dashboard designer, in the canvas fit, I can change the canvas fit from all to width, and there's an option here to automatically reposition tiles. And what this will do is if I display my dashboard on different resolutions or different screen sizes, it will rearrange my tiles so that they move to take up as much space and sensibly sort of reposition themselves as possible. So this is something that will be in 19.1. I believe there are actually going to be some future enhancements to that behavior down the line as well. So this is pretty cool if you're building responsive dashboards. And then the last thing I want to show here, if I'm in our advanced report designer, just want to font menu here now works as a search, so I can search for everyone's favorite fonts. And of course, you can see all the fonts in their particular categories there, so or in their style, if you will. So just want to pause there and see if there are any questions. I know we covered a lot. There are a lot of minor things here. Okay, so I don't see any questions, so I just want to mention a couple more small things. The first one is performance. You know I've mentioned this before in a previous lab on a 19.1 feature. I mentioned it a couple of times earlier this morning relative to some of the settings. But throughout the application, there have been fine-tunings, optimizations. So I did want to mention that that is not an insignificant, but throughout the application, there may be minor changes that help with performance. There's also a lot of fixes going into 19.1. So one of the things I want to do is give you guys an early sneak peek at the changelogs. So you'll notice, a number of enhancements, some of which we've talked about here, some of which will be future labs. So the JavaScript API, time zone calculations, we'll give the release for those in just a bit. You'll notice there's some other changes. These are some of the more minor things we mentioned. But then there's also our fix log. So with every major release, of course, we bundle in a number of fixes. And this log is pretty extensive. So I'm not going to go through it in detail. I just want to showcase that that's another part of the upgrade is the stability and fixes that we've built into our 19.1 release here. Of course, the other thing I'll mention here is as you look at 19.1, we have our upgrading guide with every major release. So when you go to download, you'll always see an updating article along with the change logs, which I definitely encourage you to particularly, as well as if you're interested in our on our knowledge base in general. I mentioned we have recordings of past labs. So if I go to the homepage of our support center and I go to videos and admin videos, particularly where this will live, if I scroll down a little bit, we have one on upgrading. This is a great guide. And we also have upgrading best practices. So we have a couple of articles here on recommendations for upgrading best practices, important files to back up, things like that. The support lab and the document that follows really mirror each other. But as you look at 19.1, I definitely recommend reviewing some of those materials as well. Awesome. I see not so many questions so much as calls of glee at some of the enhancements I've shown here. So I'm going to pause for questions or any final questions. But as I do that, let me just say that we have 2 labs planned, upcoming labs. So on June 22nd, my colleague Nick is going to be covering adding filters via the JavaScript API. And then on July 10th, I'm going to be covering a different 19.1 enhancement that I didn't mention here because it's a little more significant, is a new way of time zone handling. So I'm pretty excited about this. Previously, we had some extensibility features for time zone handling, and we're going to have some updates to how those work and real solid improvements there. So this is one that I'm pretty excited to present next month. So with that, I'm just going to pause for a few last questions, see if anyone has any that are good for the group. But otherwise, that's all the prepared content we have for today. So let me just say thanks for joining and happy reporting. And of course, if you have any topics you want us to cover, any ideas you want to see us dive into here, or you don't mind just giving us a little feedback at the end as you close the webinar, there'll be a short few question survey we always appreciate to fill out there. Great question about the log files. So you do have an example. The question came into asking for an example of the changes to the log files and if there's any additional configuration. I don't have an example prepared here, but I will say that there's no additional configuration necessary to the logs. We've just changed the format of how we write some of the content. So it'll include some extra information. You don't have to make any changes to gain that benefit there. Awesome. So with that, let me just close out by saying thanks again for joining us and happy reporting.